The first call came just after dawn, when the forest was still wrapped in mist and the crickets hadn't yet given way to birdsong. Detective Nolan Vance, a quiet man with salt-silvered stubble and a 1,000-yard stare carved by too many unsolved cases, was already awake, sipping black coffee beside the narrow window of his cabin near Pine Hollow, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was urgent, clipped, the sheriff's department. A boy, 13-year-old Caleb Mercer, had gone missing sometime the evening before. He'd been camping with his father, Ross Mercer, a wildlife biologist known in the region for his solitary research expeditions in the High-Tree Wilderness, a dense sweep of forest land notorious for its steep ridges, sudden drop-offs, and absence of reliable trails. According to the report, Ross had returned to their base camp after a brief solo trip to check a motion sensor camera and found his son gone. The fire was cold, the tent unzipped, and Caleb's pack left untouched. No sign of a struggle, no note, and no visible tracks. Just gone. By the time Nolan and his dog, Rook, a golden-orange cocker spaniel with a nose like a scalpel and the patience of a saint, arrived at the trailhead, a full SAR operation was already underway. Helicopters thundered low over the canopy while volunteers combed through thickets with GPS devices and thermal scopes, shouting Caleb's name until their voices cracked. Nolan didn't join them, not yet. He trusted Rook, who sniffed a worn hoodie of Caleb's and padded silently into the brush, tail raised, ears twitching. Vance followed. They descended into the belly of the forest, where towering pines stifled the light and the earth smelled of moss, decay, and damp bark. Nolan's breath fogged as they moved lower into a ravine, where Rook paused, ears perked, and barked once. On the ground lay a torn granola wrapper and a single boot print, half erased by dew. The print was small, likely Caleb's, but heading east, away from the camp, away from safety. As Nolan marked the spot and radioed the coordinates, he noticed something else: the forest was too quiet. Not the normal hush of wind and distance, but a vacuum of sound, like the woods were holding their breath. They pressed on. 2 miles in, they found the first truly strange clue: bones scattered beneath an old sugar pine, brittle and picked clean. At first glance they looked human, small, weathered, curled in a crescent. But Nolan knew better. He bagged a fragment and snapped a photo with his phone. "Too light," he murmured. "Probably deer or fox." Rook was already circling the base of the tree, whining softly. That's when Nolan saw it, wedged between two roots, barely visible beneath a layer of dead needles, a scrap of paper. He crouched, brushing it off. It was folded carefully, like a note passed in school. The ink was smeared but legible: "Don't look for me. I'm fine now. I had to go." The handwriting didn't match Caleb's from the school forms. Nolan's gut twisted. Someone wanted them to stop searching. Someone who'd taken the time to stage this scene. Back at base camp, Ross was inconsolable, rocking back and forth, clutching a photo of his son. He wouldn't run off, he kept saying. "We were planning the trail together. He knows these woods. He's careful." Nolan didn't doubt it. Caleb was the kind of kid who read field guides for fun, who could name birds by song and recognize scat from 20 feet away. The fact that he was missing in a place he knew intimately only deepened the mystery. Over the next 3 days, the search widened, bloodhounds brought in from Ash Ridge, drones scouring the canopy, SAR divers checking creeks and ponds. Still nothing. And then came the rain. A freak mountain storm rolled in from the west, pounding the ground with hail and washing away whatever fragile clues the forest might have offered. When the storm cleared, the official search was suspended. The sheriff called it a tragedy, a likely accident. Maybe Caleb slipped, hit his head, fell into a ravine. Ross refused to believe it. So did Nolan. Rook had picked up a trail, a real one, and the note by the bones was too deliberate. Someone had planned this. For weeks, Nolan and Rook continued alone, hiking deep into uncharted corners of the High-Tree, cross-referencing Ross's research maps and field journals. Theories spiraled through town: bear attack, a hidden sinkhole, even whispers of something darker, a local man named Silas Brayer who'd once been arrested for stalking hikers but never convicted. But there was no evidence, no body, no second sighting. Just silence. Eventually, the leads dried up. The Mercer family moved away. The story faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. Nolan filed the case in a drawer he never opened. And then, 10 years later, in the dry heat of July, a pair of geology students from the State University stumbled upon something half-buried beneath a fallen cedar near the southern edge of the high tree. They were mapping erosion patterns, testing for mineral displacement after the recent wildfire, when one of them found a child's compass, brass, cracked, initials etched crudely on the back. CM nearby, under a layer of soil, was a piece of nylon fabric that once belonged to a backpack, the kind Caleb had carried. No bones, no body. Just objects that shouldn't have been there, too far from the original search zone, too carefully hidden. When Nolan got the call, he hadn't heard Caleb's name in years. But something in his chest stirred, a weight lifting, an old promise calling. He pulled Rook's leash from the hook by the door. "Let's go, girl," he said, voice hoarse. "We've got a trail to find." The sky above the southern edge of the high tree wilderness was bleached with heat and shimmer, but under the thick canopy where the fallen cedar lay, the light fractured in shafts through pine needles and dripped like molasses over mossy stumps and wind-twisted ferns. Nolan Vance crouched next to the disturbed soil, his fingers brushing the compacted earth around the half-exposed compass and the rotting corner of nylon. He hadn't spoken since arriving, and Rook stood behind him, tail still, nose twitching, her body tense like a spring wound too tight. The compass was unmistakably Caleb's. Ross had described it in agonizing detail a decade ago, how he'd given it to his son on his 11th birthday after a long hike together, how the boy had etched his initials into the brass back with a screwdriver because he said he wanted it to feel like his own. It had no business being here, nearly 12 miles southeast of the original disappearance site, in a quadrant of the forest thought too rugged and untrailed for even the most intrepid SAR teams to explore fully. Nolan held the compass in his palm, the weight of it a memory made solid, and for a moment he saw Caleb's face again from the school portrait, narrow features, intense green eyes, a sly, half-smile. "This isn't where he died," Nolan muttered aloud. "This is where someone put it." The two geology students who had made the discovery stood nearby, pale and uncertain, both still holding their GPS gear. The taller one, Eli, explained again how they had been scanning topsoil erosion patterns when the equipment alerted them to subsurface irregularities. "We thought it was just buried rock," he said. "Or an old root. Then we saw the compass and didn't want to touch anything else." Nolan thanked them, then waved over the forensics unit that had finally managed to navigate the winding trail. Within an hour, the area was cordoned off. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a narrow depression 3 feet beneath the surface, long, straight, not deep enough to be a grave, but deliberate. As they unearthed it, they found no body, no bones. Instead, there were fragments, the ripped remains of a windbreaker, bits of colored plastic from an old flashlight, and, strangest of all, 3 small animal bones arranged in a triangle, white as porcelain, clean and unchewed. Nolan knelt and stared at them. "That's not natural," he whispered. "Someone placed these." The bones weren't human, an on-site forensic tech confirmed they likely belonged to a raccoon or fox. But their positioning was precise, too geometrical to be coincidence. Rook nosed them gently, then whined, backing away. That same day, Nolan met again with Ross Mercer, who had flown in from Colorado the moment he'd heard. The years had not been kind to him, his face was gaunt, his hair thin and gray, and his hands trembled with a nervous tremor that spoke of chronic medication or deep, lifelong grief. "You said it wasn't an accident," Ross said as they stood together beside the excavation site. "Now do you believe me?" Nolan didn't answer directly. "Did you ever take Caleb this far south?" "Never," Ross said immediately. He knew the trails, the compass bearings. He knew not to go off-grid. We marked every route together. There's no reason he'd be here unless someone brought him. Nolan finished the sentence slowly. That night, back in his cabin, Nolan sat with Rook at his feet and reopened the case files. The original SAR maps, incident logs, weather reports. Caleb had gone missing on a clear October evening. There had been no signs of forced entry at the tent, no tracks leading away from the campsite, and no animal prints nearby. Just a cold fire pit and an absence that had never explained itself. Nolan traced his finger along the southern quadrant of the old maps, overlaying them with newer GPS data. The place where the compass was found wasn't on any official trail. But to the northeast of it, there was an unmarked cabin, a ranger outpost long since decommissioned after budget cuts a decade earlier. It hadn't appeared relevant during the initial investigation because it was thought abandoned and too far off route. Nolan remembered asking about it at the time and being told by a deputy that it had been locked for years. But no one had ever searched it. Not really. The next morning, with Rook leading the way, Nolan hiked through gnarled terrain, over fallen trees and across dry creek beds until the forest opened slightly into a clearing, and there it stood, the cabin, its roof caved in partially by a fallen limb, its porch sagging but intact, the windows dirty but unbroken. Rook froze at the threshold and let out a low growl. Nolan stepped onto the porch and tried the door. It creaked open. Inside, the air was sour with old wood and rodent droppings. Dust swirled in sunbeams like ash. The furniture was skeletal, just a cot, a rusted stove, and a table stained with watermarks. But in the corner of the room, beneath a loose floorboard that Rook nosed open, they found it, a child's water bottle with stickers on the side, faded but still readable, dinosaurs and planets. Ross had described it, too. That was his, Ross confirmed when shown a photo. He took it everywhere. Why would it be here, miles away from the place Caleb vanished? Nolan felt the answer close, coiled, waiting. Forensics dated the dust layers around the bottle, determining it hadn't been moved for almost a decade. Caleb had been here. Perhaps only briefly. But he had been here. Back in town, word spread quickly. Old rumors reignited, some insisted they'd always known something darker had happened. Others whispered again of Silas Brayer, now a reclusive man in his 70s who lived alone in a trailer park on the outskirts of town. He'd been questioned once in the original case after several hikers claimed he'd followed them in the woods. Nothing had come of it, he had an alibi, and no physical evidence tied him to the disappearance. But now, with the compass and water bottle turning up, Nolan decided to revisit the past. Silas answered the door with a scowl, shirtless despite the cool evening air, the whites of his eyes tinged with yellow. Still barking up the same tree, he said bitterly. Kid disappeared. It happens. Forest eats people. Nolan kept his tone measured. Did you ever visit the old ranger station? Silas squinted. What station? Nolan showed him a satellite photo. Silas hesitated just long enough. Maybe once. Long time ago. Before they sealed it. There was no lock, Nolan said. No seal. Just a memory that everyone believed. Silas said nothing. Rook growled, pacing. Nolan noticed something strange then, an old hiking pack near the door with faded patches stitched into the sides. One of the patches had a symbol, 3 triangles, just like the bones arranged under the cedar. What does that mean? Nolan asked. Silas glanced back, then laughed dryly. Just a patch. Found it years ago. Nolan took a photo of it anyway. When he showed it to Ross later, the man went pale. Caleb was drawing something like that, he whispered. He showed me in his journal. Said he'd seen it carved into a tree on one of our hikes. I thought it was just a game. Nolan retrieved the journal, long archived, and flipped to the sketch, a triangle within a triangle, surrounded by small dots. Almost identical. Suddenly, it was clear. Caleb had found something, or someone, in the forest. Something he didn't understand. The triangle wasn't just a symbol. It was a mark. A location? A warning? A sign? But from whom? The third piece of the puzzle came not from a hiker or scientist or even the dog, but from a teenage girl with a disposable camera and a craving for ghost stories. Her name was Lila Dresden, 17 years old, a local born and raised in the town nestled against the edge of the Hightree Wilderness, and she had been sneaking into the forest with two of her friends to take photos of what they called haunted places for a school art project. The ranger cabin was their destination that day, the same one where Caleb's water bottle had been found, and while her friends joked and posed with fake scared expressions on the front porch, Lila had wandered a few yards into the trees behind the structure, drawn by the quiet, by the way the shadows curved unnaturally along the ground. She raised her camera and snapped a photo of the twisted pines, not noticing anything strange at the time. But when she developed the film that weekend in the school's darkroom, something stopped her cold. In the far right edge of the frame, just before the trees thickened into darkness, stood a figure. Barely visible, cloaked in camouflage or shadow, its outline human but not clear. It stood still, facing the camera directly. Lila told her mother, who brought it to the sheriff, who called Nolan. Nolan stared at the photo under a magnifying glass at the station, his knuckles white against the desk. He enlarged it, filtered it, inverted it. There was no mistaking it now. Someone had been watching the cabin. Recently. Silas Brayer had an alibi for that day. He'd been at a medical appointment 2 towns over, a detail easily verified. So if not Silas, then who? Who still came to the ranger station after all these years, who pinned the photo of Caleb to the tree, who arranged bones and buried belongings in strange configurations? Nolan ordered trail cameras to be placed around the area in a staggered pattern, low visibility, silent triggers, infrared for night capture. He and Rook returned to the site for a full day's sweep, focusing this time on terrain no one had touched before, steep embankments, dry ravines, animal trails that disappeared into brush. It was there, in the high ferns behind a moss-choked boulder, that Rook stopped abruptly and barked twice. Nolan moved in, gently parting the ferns. Beneath them lay another symbol, carved into a flat rock, identical to the triangle found earlier but surrounded now by a circle etched in overlapping strokes. Beneath the rock, wedged just barely into a crack, was a torn strip of canvas. Nolan bagged it, brought it back to the lab. Traces of sweat, skin cells. A partial DNA profile. It matched Caleb. Nolan didn't say a word as the tech handed him the report. His chest felt like it had been hit with a hammer. Caleb had survived longer than anyone thought. He hadn't died the first night. He had moved. He had bled. He had left something behind. For the next week, Nolan remapped everything. He layered the coordinates of each find, the compass, the bottle, the photo, the rock carvings, and saw something impossible. They formed a wide arc, a crescent, almost as if outlining something. When he drew it to scale, the shape fit around one particular valley, a basin known to locals as Miller's Drop, a steep, almost inaccessible gully with only one way in or out. It was marked on old logging maps from the 1960s but hadn't been used in decades. Nolan and Rook began the descent at dawn. The basin was a world unto itself, steep walls rising like fingers, the sky above reduced to a narrow slit. Ferns reached shoulder height. The ground was uneven, soaked in groundwater, buzzing with insects. But deeper still, near the base where a stream once flowed, they found the first man-made object, a rusted tin can, flattened and pierced with nail holes. Hanging from a tree by wire. A signal? A trap? Nearby, half submerged in a fallen log, was a child's handwriting, scratched into the bark in block letters, "Still here." The bark had regrown slightly over the letters, years old, not recent. But not a decade old either. Nolan felt Rook press close to his leg, her body vibrating with tension. He marked the spot and pushed further in. The next clue was stranger still, a stone circle, clearly constructed, with a central pit lined with ash and bone fragments. Forensics later confirmed the bones weren't human, deer, rabbit, maybe squirrel, but the ash contained traces of plastic and nylon. Clothing. Fabric. Someone had built fires here. Someone had lived here. Days later, a trail cam captured an image. A man, hunched, bearded, wearing mismatched clothes, moving quickly through the underbrush near the ranger station. The photo was grainy, but his face was partially visible. Nolan ran facial recognition. Nothing. But a secondary scan caught a feature, a tattoo on the man's left hand, partially obscured. Cross-referencing old arrest logs revealed a name, Elias Pruitt. A transient with a record for burglary and trespassing in wilderness zones, last seen in this region 15 years ago. Thought dead or gone. A ghost. But now very much alive. Nolan sent the image to Ross. Ross stared at it for several minutes. "He worked for me once," he whispered. "Before Caleb was born. One summer. Field assistant. Quiet guy. Loner. I fired him after he got aggressive with a hiker who came near our camp. He said people didn't understand the forest. That it was sacred." Sacred. The word echoed in Nolan's head. The symbols. The arranged bones. The photos. The circles. It wasn't just a hiding place. It was a belief system. A warped logic born of isolation. The deeper they searched the basin, the clearer the signs became. Hidden caches. Animal traps. Small shelters built from branches and mud. And then, finally, something undeniable. A journal. Wrapped in plastic, buried in a hollow tree. The cover was faded blue, the pages stuck together in places, but readable. The first entry was dated October 19, 4 days after Caleb's disappearance. The handwriting was shaky but legible. It was Caleb. He said he found me. Said I couldn't go back yet. Said the forest would be angry. I didn't believe him, but I was scared. He brings food. It smells weird. I'm hiding this in case someone comes. The entries continued for weeks. Disjointed, frightened, sometimes lucid, sometimes rambling. Caleb described days of waiting, of wandering the basin, of being watched, of rituals, small fires, symbols drawn in dirt, bones placed in circles. Then the tone shifted. I tried to leave. He caught me. Said the forest would take me if I did. I don't think he's lying anymore. The last entry was dated almost 7 months after the first. I found a place he doesn't know. I'm going to stay there. If anyone finds this, tell my dad I didn't stop looking for a way out. Nolan closed the journal slowly, grief and fury bleeding into his bones. Caleb had lived. Had fought. Had resisted. The rest of the journal's pages were torn or mold-eaten, but one final line had been scribbled in the back cover: "Circle breaks in spring." What did it mean? A time? A signal? Nolan had the forensics team scan the entire journal for latent prints. They found 2 sets, one Caleb's, one unknown but matching the trail cam man, Elias Pruitt. It was now a manhunt. Helicopters, teams with dogs, tactical units. But Pruitt knew the forest better than anyone. Days passed. He slipped through their nets like smoke. And then, just as they were scaling back again, Rook found something near the northern ridge of the basin, a small cave, shallow, filled with old blankets, bones, and food wrappers. The clouds hung low over the forest canopy as Detective Hal Granger adjusted the collar of his coat, boots sinking slightly into the mossy ground as he followed his orange cocker spaniel, Rusty, through the dense underbrush west of where the boy's backpack had been found. The dog had been agitated since dawn, circling patches of disturbed earth and growling toward the tree-line, where branches looked unnaturally bent, as though something heavy had moved through days ago. The search parties had thinned out after the rain began, but Hal remained, alone but not idle, walking parallel to the dry creek that cut across the ridge like a scar. He hadn't told anyone, but the crumpled note found with the bones, "He cries when he's hungry," had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. It was written in hurried, childlike script, and he wasn't yet convinced it had come from the boy. Rusty suddenly froze, ears perked and body rigid, and Hal crouched low instinctively, brushing aside wet ferns to see what had stopped the dog. Ahead was a weathered fence, half swallowed by vines and leaning at awkward angles, enclosing a small, collapsed shack that didn't appear on any of the forestry maps he'd reviewed. The structure was barely standing, its roof caved in on one side, windows gaping like dead eyes, and Hal's gut churned as he approached. Rusty whimpered and stayed behind him, tail lowered. Stepping over the broken threshold, Hal scanned the dark interior and was immediately struck by the smell, something sour, metallic, and old. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he moved further inside, flashlight beam catching on rusted tools, a sagging mattress, and a bundle of cloth in the corner that looked too deliberate to be debris. He reached for it carefully, unwrapping what turned out to be a small blue hoodie, muddied and torn at the sleeves, the name Ben stitched along the inside tag in faded thread. His breath caught. This was the boy's. He took a step back, heart racing, as Rusty began barking from outside, spinning in place and darting toward the trees. Hal dropped the hoodie into his satchel and followed, drawn by Rusty's urgency. The dog was already down the hill, barking furiously at a thick patch of blackberry bramble, and Hal caught up just in time to see something glint beneath the thorns. Kneeling, he pulled back the thorny vines with gloved hands, revealing an old metal hatch, square, rusted, and half covered in moss. It looked like an access door, but to what? There was no sign of recent use, but the latch wasn't locked, only crusted with age. He pried it open with effort, the hinges groaning in protest, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. The smell from earlier returned, stronger here, mixing with damp earth and something faintly chemical. Rusty barked again, pawing at the edge as Hal took out his flashlight and carefully began to descend. The narrow shaft opened into a low-ceilinged room, concrete walls damp and pitted, with a dirt floor and what looked like broken furniture scattered across one side. A set of children's drawings hung on the far wall, held in place by rusted nails, crude stick figures, sun and trees, and in one, a tall person standing next to a smaller one with a sad face. A table nearby held empty cans, chewed granola bars, and a baby blanket. His blood went cold. This wasn't an accident, someone had kept the child here, and it had been prepared. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, dead, but the wiring looked recently disturbed. Then he saw the footprints, smaller ones, barefoot, leading toward the far end of the room where a second door, steel and sealed shut with a crossbar, stood. Hal approached it cautiously, heart pounding, but before he could lift the bar, a sound from above, branches snapping, movement, snapped him back into high alert. He turned off his flashlight, drew his pistol, and listened. Someone was moving through the forest above. Silently, he ascended the ladder and eased the hatch closed behind him, crouching in the undergrowth beside it, barely breathing. Within seconds, a figure emerged from the trees, tall, male, wearing a raincoat and carrying a lantern. The man moved directly toward the hatch, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. Hal waited until he reached for the hatch handle, then leapt up, gun raised, and shouted, "Hands up! Don't move!" The man froze, then bolted. Hal chased him through the brambles, branches tearing at his face, Rusty barking wildly behind them. The man was fast, knowing the terrain, but Hal had adrenaline and a purpose. They ran downslope until the man tripped on a root and went sprawling. Hal was on him in seconds, pinning him down, identifying himself, and calling for backup on his radio. The man was in his late 40s, unshaven, eyes wild. He said his name was Carl Winton, that he was only checking on the place, and that he hadn't meant to keep the boy so long. Hal's mind reeled. He cuffed Winton and hiked him back up to the hatch, demanding answers, but the man clammed up, only muttering about orders and how the boy wasn't supposed to be found. Backup arrived within the hour, uniformed officers, forensic techs, and a search and rescue unit that quickly descended into the underground shelter. They found what Hal had feared, evidence that the boy had lived there for weeks, food wrappers, drawings, even a calendar with days crossed off. But the steel door at the back? That led into a deeper tunnel, part of an old Cold War-era bunker system that extended north, something not even locals remembered. The boy wasn't inside. He'd been moved. A trail of boot prints in the tunnel suggested at least one more person had taken him further underground, maybe even toward the next exit, a mile away. Hal felt a surge of frustration, so close. But the capture of Winton gave them hope. They had someone to question, and that night, under pressure, the man finally spoke. He said he was paid to watch the child, that a woman, he only knew her as R, brought the boy to him and said it was temporary. She paid cash, left supplies, and warned him not to speak to anyone. He hadn't seen her in a week. When asked why he ran, he said, "She said if I talked, she'd find me." I believed her. Hal didn't sleep that night. The pieces were moving too fast. He had a name, just a letter, but it was something. And the map of the old bunker, now unearthed by city engineers, showed 5 more sealed doors and 2 exits, one just beyond the old lumberyard where the railroad used to pass. He knew where he was going at dawn. And this time, he wouldn't leave without the boy. The 5th day inside the forest house brought with it a strange shift in atmosphere, not in any visible change, but in the way the silence grew heavier and the house seemed to breathe with them, every creak in the wooden walls like the groan of a hidden witness, and as the 4 survivors tried to ration out the remaining food and continue marking days on the wall with the edge of a broken spoon, Marta began scratching out her own name beside her tally marks, then hesitated and carved it deeper. As if afraid her name might disappear if she didn't press hard enough, while Anton spent most of his time standing silently at the small cracked window in the second room, staring through the filmy glass at the unmoving woods, the same crooked tree with a hollow trunk, and the same patch of mushrooms that no one dared touch, and when Victor finally asked him what he was looking at, Anton simply replied, "I'm waiting for it to blink," which sent a wave of unease through everyone even though no one pressed him further, but that night, as the wind howled again, louder than before and without pause, something thudded against the side of the house with a dull, wet sound, and for the first time since their arrival, they all gathered in the center room, holding hands like children trying to keep a nightmare away, but the noise didn't come again, and by morning they found no marks outside, no blood, no feathers, no animal prints, just the same untouched ground as if the forest refused to acknowledge anything had happened at all, and that denial, that eerie reset, began to wear down their minds more than any hunger or fear, because they no longer trusted their own memories of the place, and Andrei began asking if they were dead and this was some kind of punishment, which made Marta snap and yell at him to shut up, her voice echoing too loud, drawing birds from the trees in the distance, birds they hadn't seen before, small black ones with twisted tails that flew in tight circles above the treetops, and for the first time in days, they saw something new, a piece of clothing fluttering in a tree near the edge of the clearing, clearly human, a shredded red shirt that none of them recognized, and Anton said it hadn't been there yesterday, and even though it terrified them, they all agreed to approach it, moving in a tight line, their backs nearly touching, and as they got closer they saw that the shirt was caught on a broken branch about 10 feet up, torn and stained with something dark, but what made them freeze was the fact that something white was nestled in the crook of the branch, something that looked like a roll of paper, too clean to belong in that rotting forest, and after much arguing, Victor climbed the tree, nearly falling twice, and when he brought it down, they saw it was indeed a rolled-up note, bound with a thin strip of green leather, and inside it were only 6 words, scrawled in uneven block letters. "You are not the first ones," which made Marta start crying immediately while Andrei fell to his knees and began muttering a prayer, and even Victor, who had been the most rational, couldn't explain it, especially since the paper had no water damage, no mold, and smelled faintly of lavender, a scent none of them had experienced since arriving, and they burned the note that night in the stove just to be safe, but it did little to ease the growing pressure they all felt, as if the trees were watching more closely now, and Anton insisted. The mushrooms outside were moving slightly each night, growing closer to the house in small, measured inches, and on the 6th morning, when they opened the back door for fresh air, they saw a crude symbol painted in thick white ash on the outer wall, 3 interlocking circles with a line through the middle, and none of them had ever seen it before, but Marta whispered, "My grandmother used to draw that, to keep things out," and they all stared at her, needing more, but she just shook her head and backed into the room, refusing to say another word, and that silence became her new ritual, retreating into herself as the house grew colder, despite the weather outside being warm and still, and Andrei started waking up in the middle of the night screaming that something was inside the house, pointing at nothing with wide, glassy eyes, and each time they would calm him, only for him to forget the episode entirely by morning, and this cycle repeated until the 7th night, when the screaming didn't stop, and they found him sitting in the center of the house with his back to them, his hands clasped around something no one could see, and when Victor tried to grab him, Andrei recoiled like a wild animal and shouted, "If I let go, it comes through," and his voice didn't sound like his own, it sounded older, more guttural, and it took them an hour to sedate him using old painkillers Marta had in her bag, but even unconscious he gripped his hands together tightly, and they left him like that on the floor because none of them wanted to be the one to pull his fingers apart, and when morning came, he was gone, not just missing, but utterly absent, with no trace of a struggle, no torn clothing or blood or open door, just the imprint of his body in the dust where he had lain and a set of wet footprints leading up the wall to the ceiling and then disappearing halfway across, which made Victor throw up in the sink and Anton start pacing in rapid, tight loops, counting under his breath in German, even though he wasn't German and no one had ever heard him speak the language before, and Marta stopped scratching the wall after that and began building something instead, using wood from a broken table and the few tools they'd found in the cellar, a small frame, barely larger than a shoebox, into which she packed dirt and moss and feathers in a strange symmetrical pattern, then placed it under the table like a shrine, saying nothing about its purpose, and no one dared move it, especially after that night when a heavy thud shook the roof and left a large crack in the ceiling, revealing old beams and a nest of dead birds, all with their beaks broken, and as they lay awake after that, no longer speaking, each listening for different things, the sound of breathing behind walls, the click of movement above the ceiling, or the distant hum that came from beneath the floorboards like a buried machine still functioning in secret, they realized the house didn't want them to leave, not out of malice, but out of need, like it fed off them, and now that one of them was gone, it would soon want another. The rising sun filtered through the ancient trees like soft gold through stained glass, but no warmth came with it. Nathan felt the chill of the forest pressing in as he stood just beyond the crooked fence of the abandoned house, his boots sinking slightly into the damp forest floor that had been left untouched for decades. The others had gone, police, media, even most of the forensics team, leaving only a temporary perimeter and a few orange cones that looked absurd in such a forgotten place. Yet he remained, his fingers tightening around the strap of his bag as he turned back toward the house, unable to leave it behind. Inside, the silence was no longer merely the absence of sound, it had grown heavier, pregnant with something unspoken. The kitchen still reeked faintly of mildew and dust, but beneath that lingered a smell Nathan couldn't quite place, something metallic and sharp, like rust and blood. As he stepped through the hallway again, every footstep echoed slightly too loud, as if the walls themselves were waiting. The evidence board he'd hastily assembled in the living room was now cluttered with photos, documents, and maps, each piece pinned with desperation rather than order. At the center were the 4 missing people, Gavin, Troy, Emily, and Vera, faces smiling under mountain sunlight, forever unaware of the horror that awaited them. Nathan traced his finger along a hand-drawn path between their last known GPS coordinates and the location of the house, the line curling like a serpent through dense terrain, past 3 small cabins, and ending here. No roads led directly to the house, only overgrown trails and the crude tire marks found days ago, now washed away by rain. The discovery of Gavin's notebook in the cellar had cracked everything wide open. In its pages were frantic, fragmented entries. "They're watching again. Troy said we're being followed. We shouldn't have entered the ravine." Some pages were torn, others water-damaged, but one sentence stood out: "The door wasn't locked when we found it. Someone left it open." Nathan moved to the basement, flashlight in hand, its narrow beam cutting through the thick, stale air. The stairs groaned but held as he descended, boots brushing against old cloth and shattered pottery. At the bottom, he turned left past the toppled shelf and approached the concrete slab where Gavin had reportedly been found, unconscious, weeks after vanishing. Something about this place defied logic. The temperatures were always colder below ground. The air was dry, but the walls were moist. And in the far right corner, behind the false panel he had found just days ago, was the entrance to a tunnel system that had never been on any official map. He ducked inside, heart pounding, the passage narrow and sloping downward. His flashlight flickered as if protesting, and the silence became so dense he could hear his own pulse. The tunnel twisted, then split into two directions. He took the left path, scraping against stone, his mind drifting back to Vera's last phone message, garbled audio, a scream, then static. She had said the word roots, but no one knew what it meant. Now, as he walked, Nathan began to notice the strange carvings on the stone walls, patterns repeating in perfect loops, circles with jagged edges, symbols resembling stylized trees, and something like an eye always watching. He reached a cavern where the air opened up suddenly, and he could stand fully. There was an altar at the center, built from bone and moss, lit only by his trembling light. Around it were remnants, old bags, a broken phone, scraps of clothing, items confirmed to have belonged to the missing four. But what chilled Nathan most was a handprint in dried mud on the far wall, small, too small to belong to any of the adults. And beside it, faintly etched, "He walks in silence. He waits beneath." Nathan backed out, fear tightening his spine, but as he turned, he caught a sound, a breath, or perhaps a whisper, not from behind, but from within the wall itself. He ran then, not out of panic, but out of the sharp knowledge that he had crossed a boundary that should never have been touched. Back at the surface, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees in mournful tones. He sat on the porch, staring at the forest, wondering what Gavin had seen before collapsing. It wasn't just isolation or starvation, it was fear, so deep it had paralyzed him. Days later, Nathan filed his report, and the house was sealed off again by authorities. But he couldn't let it go. He kept seeing the symbols in his dreams, hearing the whispering voices beneath the soil. The final breakthrough came when he received an anonymous envelope in the mail. Inside were 5 photographs, taken from above, drone-like images of the house, the surrounding forest, and one peculiar shot of a circular clearing a few kilometers north, completely symmetrical, where the trees seemed to lean away from the center. In that space, nothing grew. Nathan hiked there the next day, cutting through underbrush and marsh. When he arrived, he stood in the middle of the clearing and felt a pressure in his chest, not physical, but emotional, like the presence of something ancient and deeply wrong. At the edge of the clearing, he found a stone marker half buried in the soil. He brushed away the dirt to reveal the same symbol from the tunnel, the jagged circle surrounding the watchful eye. Behind it, embedded in the earth, was another passage. And though every instinct in him screamed to turn back, Nathan knew the story wasn't over. Someone had led him here. Someone who wanted the truth uncovered, or perhaps someone who wanted him to disappear, too. The trail had grown colder with every hour, but Detective Harold Blake refused to let the silence of the woods dull his instincts, and now, with the orange cocker spaniel trotting quietly beside him, nose low to the mossy forest floor, they approached an area that had been overlooked in previous sweeps. An old irrigation ditch that had dried out years ago but still carved a shallow line through the base of the hills just west of where the boy had last been seen, the map in Harold's hand showed. Nothing unusual, no markers, no properties, just a strip of unclaimed woodland, but something in the dog's posture made him pause, then follow as it veered sharply left, barking once, a low, alert sound, and stopped at a patch of soil that looked disturbed, as though someone had recently dug and quickly tried to disguise their work. Kneeling, Harold brushed the surface gently with his glove, revealing not bone or cloth this time, but a flattened tin box rusted at the edges and sealed with old duct tape, and as he peeled it open, expecting perhaps a map or keepsake, what lay inside were dozens of torn photographs, some water-damaged, others pristine, of children, not just the missing boy, but several others, their eyes inked out crudely with black marker, their faces captured at schoolyards, parks, and unfamiliar backyards, always from a distance, always as if watched. And tucked beneath them was a hand-drawn diagram of what appeared to be a layout of a basement, or bunker, with notes in jittery handwriting that read, "Safe under roots," and "Don't let the dog follow the noise." Harold's blood ran cold, not only from the implication of the photographs but from the realization that the map was a key, perhaps even a confession, and as the dog growled softly, staring into the thicket ahead, Harold shoved the box into his bag and moved carefully in that direction, pushing through branches until he reached a slight incline where the earth rose unnaturally, piled in a way that didn't match the terrain, and here, half hidden beneath overgrown ferns, he found the entrance, a rotted wooden door buried in the slope, reinforced with iron latches, and marked faintly with red paint, a symbol not unlike an eye. He radioed in the coordinates but received only static. The hills must have blocked the signal, so he drew his sidearm and knelt, pressing his ear to the door, hearing nothing, but sensing something old, stale, and wrong behind it. Forcing the latch, he pulled it open. With a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a short tunnel of stone, damp and narrow, and descended slowly with his flashlight sweeping across the walls, every surface etched with childlike carvings, stick figures, animals, words like "run" and "quiet" scratched over and over. The spaniel whimpered but followed, pressing close to Harold's leg, and soon they reached a chamber, roughly circular, perhaps 10 feet across, where makeshift bedding and old food cans sat undisturbed, and in the corner, a series of shallow holes had been dug into the dirt wall, each barely wide enough to hide something, or someone. He counted 6, all empty, and above them was written in charcoal, "They don't stay forever. The woods take them back." Harold felt his pulse hammering, the air thick with the smell of rot and damp leaves, and then the dog bolted, barking furiously toward a narrow opening at the far side, one Harold hadn't noticed at first, where a draft of cold air flowed through. Crawling through, he emerged into a second space, smaller, lined with shelves made of tree branches, and here he found what he feared, dolls made from cloth and hair, pinned with nails, each labeled with names. Some he recognized from missing persons reports, others he didn't. The dog stood motionless, staring at a wall where photos had been pinned, each one of a child standing beside an adult whose face had been scratched out entirely. Harold took a photo closer and saw the boy they were searching for, standing near what appeared to be a forest ranger. Only something about the uniform seemed wrong. The patch on the arm was reversed, the badge unmarked, and Harold realized they might have been looking for the wrong kind of suspect all along. This wasn't the work of a single hermit or madman, but someone who blended in, someone who used the trust of authority to lure children in, and then vanish into the forest's folds. Returning above ground, the sun had begun to dip, and with no signal he had no choice but to mark the site and retreat, hoping his camera's GPS would record the location. He camped nearby, the dog curled at his feet, both of them restless, and by morning, after hiking back to a ranger station, he relayed everything. Only to be told no such structure was listed in any records, and worse, when investigators returned, the wooden door was gone, the hillside smooth and undisturbed as if nothing had ever been buried there. The photographs he had taken were still in his phone, but the box itself, which he had carried in his bag, had vanished during the night, as had the hand-drawn map, though the brass at headquarters doubted his story. Harold knew what he had seen, and more importantly, what he hadn't, because in one photo on his phone, the one of the boy standing beside the ranger, a second figure had appeared in the background, obscured by branches, a thin man holding a stick with something dangling from it, a bell or a toy, and his eyes, barely visible through the leaves, seemed fixed on the camera with a knowing stare. Harold had the photo enhanced, printed, and hung beside his desk, and each morning he studied that face, trying to remember where he'd seen it before, because deep inside, he was certain the boy was still alive, and that someone was still watching. The rain returned the next morning, sweeping across the canopy in waves like sighs of the mountain itself, as if the forest too was mourning something it couldn't name, and beneath that heavy veil of grey sky, Detective Hale Norwood trudged forward with Murphy bounding beside him, both soaked through and covered in clinging mud, but now moving with renewed purpose toward the coordinates etched in the margin of the boy's drawing, coordinates that pointed not just to a location but to an answer. The kind of answer that had left tremors in the child's innocent mind and sleeplessness in his parents' weary hearts. As they descended the ravine near Red Hollow, Hale paused beside a moss-slicked outcropping where a half-buried length of fencing hinted at an older property line, something no longer in use, forgotten by time and overlooked by search parties who'd always assumed nothing significant existed beyond the steep drop. But Murphy's nose worked furiously, drawing them along a narrow, deer path until it opened into a sunken clearing where a structure sat collapsed beneath the rot of decades, an old gamekeeper's shed, nearly consumed by vines and root systems, and just beyond it, the remnants of a trail that had been intentionally disguised with fallen limbs and brush. Hale examined the surroundings with care, noticing small things, a child's sneaker almost buried in moss, the faint glimmer of plastic beneath soil, the loop of a shoelace, until Murphy let out a low growl and darted behind the shed, tail high, ears perked, and Hale followed, gun drawn now, heart pounding, stepping through the collapsed doorway into a dark, damp interior that smelled of mildew and rodent nests, but there was something more, an unnatural odor, a human one, sweat and rot and fear. Tucked into the far wall was a metal hatch, recently disturbed, the dirt around it unsettled, and Hale knelt, brushed it clear, and lifted, revealing a narrow passage dug into the hillside, lined with plywood and tarps, descending at an angle so steep it nearly formed a chute, and without hesitation he entered, flashlight cutting through the dark like a scalpel through flesh, revealing a tunnel no more than 4 feet high, crawling with roots and condensation, leading deeper into the mountain until the walls changed, no longer earth, but stone, shaped and smoothed, intentional. Here he found himself standing before a heavy iron door embedded in a concrete wall, clearly not the work of any hunter or survivalist, and it was here Murphy barked again, a sound not of alarm but insistence. Hale pressed forward, found the door unlocked but stiff with rust, and when it groaned open, the light revealed a chamber that made his blood run cold, rows of drawings pinned to the walls, children's drawings, like the one Jacob had made, only here they were warped, violent, depicting cages and dark shapes, screaming mouths and spiral eyes, each signed with a name and a date, many years old. In the corner was a cot, stained and unkempt, beside it a pile of books, notebooks filled with rants about the echo beneath the soil, and the voice that returns when all others go silent, ramblings from a mind undone, and in the center of the room stood a desk with a cracked lamp still powered by a car battery, illuminating a single Polaroid photograph, a boy, Jacob, but taken weeks ago, after the disappearance, standing in this very room, eyes wide, mouth open mid-sob, as if caught in the middle of calling for help. The sight made Hale clench the photo tight, his pulse hammering, because the room was empty now, long abandoned, but not forgotten. It had been lived in, used, and only recently vacated, and then, from deeper still in the passage, came a metallic scrape, faint but unmistakable, and Hale snapped off the light and pressed his back to the wall, listening, heart hammering. And Murphy let out a soft growl as a new figure stepped into the light, a man, gaunt, wild-haired, clothes tattered, holding a lantern and muttering to himself, unaware of Hale's presence as he began speaking to the walls, as if coaxing something hidden, calling it by name. "You're still here, aren't you? Always watching, always listening. They never believed me, but the boy did. He saw you too." Hale waited, breath held, until the man turned and froze, eyes locking on the glint of Hale's badge in the flashlight beam, and in that moment, the man didn't run or scream, but simply smiled, a wide, broken thing, and whispered, "He's not yours to save anymore." Then he reached behind the desk and pulled a lever, the walls groaned, the floor shuddered, and the air filled with a mechanical hum as something deep within the earth shifted, and Murphy barked in alarm as a panel of stone slid open behind the man, revealing another corridor, darker and colder, lined with steel reinforcement and the smell of old death. The man disappeared into it, And Hale lunged forward, but the panel began to close with a grinding finality, and though he dove and managed to wedge his flashlight into the seam, the mechanism locked tight, trapping the man beyond reach. Panting, Hale looked around, realizing this chamber had been one of many, a series of interconnected hideouts or cells, each with its own secrets, and he began documenting the evidence, photographing the drawings, collecting the notebooks, and bagging the Polaroid, but the deeper corridor now blocked left an ache in his gut, because it was clear now this was not the origin of the horror, only a waypoint, and the real lair, the true source of Jacob's trauma and the disappearances that dotted local history like unmarked graves, lay beyond that sealed panel, guarded by more than just metal and stone. And as he emerged hours later into the blinding daylight, soaked and exhausted, Hale was met by a ranger patrol he'd called earlier from the ridge, backup who helped him descend safely, but not before he told them flatly, "This case isn't over. We didn't find the boy. We just found where they kept him. There's more, deeper." And Murphy, as if in agreement, let out a soft whine and stared back at the forest, tail stiff, ears pricked, nose to the wind, catching a scent that promised only one thing: the trail wasn't cold yet.